"In a few minutes you will be dead," confessed the wife as she handed the will to the husband who had humiliated and mistreated her for years. When he realized he had just eaten the dinner she had prepared, he turned pale. The rain punished the fields that night, as if the sky sensed the tragedy that was about to happen. Lightning intermittently illuminated the sky, projecting ghostly shadows through the windows of the small wooden house. Thomas waited sitting at the kitchen table, his hands calloused from years of hard work, clutching a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He knew they would come. It was just a matter of time. His sun-marked face showed traces of worry, but his eyes revealed an unshakable determination. Emily, his only daughter, was sleeping in the room next door, at least that's what he thought. In fact, the 13-year-old girl was awake, unable to sleep with the noise of the storm, and the tension she had felt coming from her father in recent days. "I won't give up what I've spent my whole life building," Thomas muttered to himself, looking through the window into the darkness. "This land is my daughter's future." The sound of approaching vehicles made Thomas rise quickly. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the muddy yard. There were 3 pickup trucks that stopped in front of the house. Thomas took a deep breath, adjusted his worn shirt, and walked to the door. Emily, curious and frightened, silently left her room and hid behind a cabinet in the living room, from where she could see and hear everything without being noticed. The thin girl with brown hair and large expressive eyes trembled slightly, not from cold but from an instinctive fear. She saw her father standing by the door, shoulders raised in a posture she knew well, the one he assumed when he was ready to face trouble. He shouldn't have come here, Emily thought, recognizing Richard Hayes getting out of the first truck. Dad said this man only brings trouble. Thomas opened the door before they even knocked. In front of him stood Richard Hayes, a tall, robust 50-year-old man with impeccably combed grey hair and a cold look that contrasted with his fake smile. He wore expensive clothes, protected from the rain by a hat and a long coat. Behind him, 5 men remained in a semicircle, all with severe expressions and hands close to their belts, where Emily could see shapes that she suspected were weapons. Richard removed his hat in a falsely courteous gesture, water dripping from the brim as the rain continued to fall. "Thomas, my friend, what a terrible night for a visit, isn't it?" "But I have business that couldn't wait," said Richard, his falsely friendly voice echoing in the small room. "I have here the documents to make the sale of your land official. The price is more than fair, as we discussed." Thomas's face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Richard's. The tension between the 2 men was palpable, charged by years of history that Emily only vaguely understood. Her father had mentioned several times that Richard Hayes had always coveted his lands, the only ones in the region with direct access to the river and with exceptionally fertile soil. Thomas never wanted to sell, despite the increasingly insistent offers in recent months. Emily shrank even more in her hiding place, her eyes never leaving the scene that was unfolding. "There was no discussion, Richard." "You know very well that my answer has always been and continues to be no," Thomas replied firmly, blocking the entrance. "This land is not for sale at any price. Now, I ask you to leave my property." Richard kept his smile, but his eyes hardened. He made a slow gesture, and 2 of his men advanced into the house, pushing Thomas aside. Emily suppressed a scream, covering her mouth with her hands. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared they might hear it. The men began to ransack the living room, knocking over the few pieces of furniture and personal objects. Richard entered walking slowly, stepping on the wooden floor with his expensive leather boots, leaving mud marks wherever he went. "You see, Thomas, I didn't really come to ask your permission," said Richard, taking an envelope from the inside pocket of his coat. "I have here an eviction order. These lands now have another owner. You can leave with dignity and some money in your pocket, or you can make everything much more difficult." Thomas stepped forward, snatching the paper from Richard's hands and tearing it to pieces. His eyes shone with fury, but there was something else there, determination. Emily had never seen her father so angry, and it frightened her. She wanted to run to him, but something kept her paralyzed in her hiding place, as if she knew that revealing her presence would make the situation worse. One of Richard's men stepped forward, threatening, but Richard gestured for him to back down. The fake smile had completely disappeared from his face. "That order is false, and you know it. I have all the documents that prove this land is mine, passed down by my father and his father before," said Thomas, his voice low and controlled, but full of emotion. "I may not have your money or your influence, but I have the truth on my side." Richard's expression changed, losing all pretense of civility. His eyes narrowed and his mouth twisted into a hard line. The storm was intensifying outside, with thunder echoing ever closer. The rain beat hard against the windows, as if wanting to enter and witness the confrontation. Richard stepped forward, coming face to face with Thomas. Emily could see the profile of both men, illuminated by a particularly close lightning strike. The contrast between them was stark. Her father honest and simple, Richard corrupt and sophisticated. "The truth. Let me tell you a truth, Thomas," whispered Richard, loud enough for Emily to hear. "The truth is that nobody will care when you simply disappear. Accidents happen every day on farms like this one." What happened next was etched in Emily's memory forever. Her father, recognizing the real threat, pushed Richard back and ran toward a shotgun he kept hanging above the fireplace. But before he could reach it, Richard made a quick move. A metallic gleam appeared in his hand. Emily saw her father stop abruptly, an expression of surprise replacing the determination on his face. Thomas staggered backward, his hands automatically going to his abdomen. Between his fingers, a dark liquid began to spread on his shirt. Richard remained still, watching with an almost curious expression. "You've made a terrible mistake," said Thomas, his voice already weaker, looking directly at the spot where Emily was hiding. "She will make you pay for this." Richard followed Thomas's gaze, and for a moment Emily thought she had been discovered, but a deafening thunder distracted everyone in the room. Thomas seized the moment to lunge against Richard, using his last strength. The two men fell to the floor, wrestling. Richard's henchmen rushed to separate them, pulling Thomas off their boss. Richard stood up, adjusting his now blood-stained clothes, an expression of fury on his face. He ordered his men to release Thomas, who fell heavily to the floor. Richard leaned over him. "Who will make me pay, Thomas? Who?" demanded Richard, holding Thomas's face to force him to look at him. "There's no one here to witness what happened except my men." Thomas, even in his weakened state, managed one last defiant smile. His eyes again found Emily's hiding place, and this time he moved his head slightly, as if saying goodbye. Emily stifled a sob, silent tears running down her face. Her father was dying right in front of her, and she could do nothing to help him. She felt an overwhelming mixture of fear, sadness, and surprisingly, anger. An anger that began to burn in her chest like a glowing coal. "Time will reveal the truth," were Thomas's last words, before his eyes lost focus and his body completely relaxed. Richard stood up, cleaning his hands on a handkerchief as if he could easily erase what he had done. He ordered his men to search the house for documents. Emily remained motionless in her hiding place, barely breathing, as the men rummaged through every corner of the small house. They found the box where Thomas kept all important papers, deeds, contracts, property history. Richard quickly examined each document before throwing them into a pile in the middle of the room. When he finished, he took a lighter from his pocket. "No documents, no proof of ownership," said Richard, lighting the lighter and bringing it close to the pile of papers. A truly sad fatality. A man alone, a violent storm, a domestic accident. No one will question it. The papers began to burn slowly. Richard and his men left the house, leaving behind Thomas's body and the small bonfire of documents that was beginning to spread. Emily waited until she heard the sound of vehicles driving away before coming out of her hiding place. She ran to her father, kneeling beside him. She knew he was dead, but still called out to him, shaking his cold body. The rain came in through the open door, mixing with her tears. The fire was beginning to spread, fueled by the dry papers. "Dad, please don't leave me," whispered Emily, hugging Thomas's body. "What will I do now?" With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Emily dragged her father's body away from the fire that was beginning to consume the room. She managed to take him to the back porch, protected from the rain by the extended roof. There, kneeling beside her father's body, with the storm raging around and the orange glow of the fire growing behind her, Emily made a promise. It wasn't a childish or impulsive promise. It was a cold, calculated promise, born at the exact moment when a 13-year-old girl's innocence died along with her father. "I swear, Father, that I will make Richard Hayes pay for every drop of your blood," said Emily, her voice surprisingly firm and devoid of emotion. "I will not rest until he loses everything he values, just as he made me lose you." Emily remained there, wet from the rain and her father's blood, while the house where she grew up was consumed by flames. When the authorities finally arrived hours later, they found a girl sitting silently beside her father's body, with dry eyes and an expression that made them uneasy. The local sheriff, a middle-aged man with a shiny badge and tired eyes, approached Emily cautiously. "Girl, can you tell me what happened here?" asked the sheriff, kneeling to be at Emily's height. "Did you see who did this to your father?" Emily looked at the man, her young eyes showing a disconcerting coldness. She immediately noticed how the sheriff avoided looking directly at her father's body, how his gaze shifted to the partially burned house, how he already seemed to be formulating a convenient conclusion in his mind. More importantly, she noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the sweat on his forehead, despite the cold night. Signs of nervousness or guilt. "I didn't see anything, sir," Emily replied in a monotone voice. "I was sleeping. When I woke up to the noise, the house was on fire and I found my father like this." The sheriff made some superficial notes in a small notebook, clearly relieved by the response. He stood up and began giving orders to his assistants to remove the body and record the scene. Emily remained seated, observing everything with a frightening lucidity for someone of her age and situation. A social worker was called to take care of her, a kind woman but exhausted by the system that employed her. "Come, dear, you can't stay here," said the social worker, extending her hand to Emily. "We'll find a safe place for you to stay for now." Emily allowed herself to be led to an official car, but before getting in, she looked back one last time. That's when she saw it. A familiar pickup truck approaching on the dirt road, now transformed into mud by the rain that was beginning to subside. Richard Hayes was getting out of the vehicle, his face composed into a mask of civic concern. Emily observed how he approached the sheriff, how the two talked in low tones, how money seemed to change hands discreetly. The last image Emily had of her childhood was Richard Hayes smiling and shaking the sheriff's hand, while her father's body was carried away in a black bag. "One day I'll come back," Emily thought as the car drove away from the only home she had ever known. "And when that day comes, you'll regret leaving me alive." 10 years passed. Time, merciless in its constancy, had transformed little Emily into a refined and determined woman. At 23, she barely remembered the appearance of the frightened girl from that fatal night. Her brown hair was now long and well kept. Her body had developed elegant curves. Her face acquired delicate but firm features. Only her eyes remained the same, deep, observant, but now hiding a calculating coldness that few noticed at first glance. Emily was sitting in an elegant cafe in the financial center of the city, reviewing documents on her laptop while waiting for an important meeting. She wore an impeccable suit that accentuated her upright and confident posture. Anyone who saw her would assume she was born into this world of power and money. "Miss Winters, Michael Cooper will be here in 5 minutes," informed the receptionist, approaching her table. "Can I bring you anything else while you wait?" "I'm fine, thank you," replied Emily with a polite but distant smile. "Just ask him to join me as soon as he arrives." Nobody in that city knew her true story. After her father's death, Emily was sent to live with a distant aunt in another state, a lonely woman who barely noticed her presence. This served Emily's purposes perfectly. From the first day, she devoted herself to her studies with an intensity that frightened her teachers. She had no friends, didn't participate in social activities, didn't waste a single minute. Every moment was dedicated to her plan of revenge, meticulously elaborated over the years. She earned a full scholarship to study economics and finance at the best university, graduating with highest honors and attracting the attention of major financial companies. "Knowledge is power, and power is the only thing Richard Hayes respects," Emily muttered to herself, closing a file on her laptop. "Soon I'll have enough power to destroy him." Michael Cooper entered the cafe exactly at the scheduled time. He was a 50-year-old man, elegant and confident, considered one of the most astute and ruthless investors in the market. He wore a tailored suit and carried an Italian leather briefcase, discreet symbols of his wealth and influence. His sharp eyes quickly assessed Emily as he approached. Emily stood to greet him, her posture perfect, her handshake firm. She knew exactly the kind of impression she wanted to make. "Miss Winters, a pleasure to finally meet you in person," said Cooper, sitting across from her. "Your analyses of the agricultural market deeply impressed me. It's not common to see someone so young with such understanding of the nuances in this sector." Emily maintained a moderate smile, calculated to appear proud but not arrogant. She had spent the last 3 years obsessively studying every aspect of the agricultural market, specifically in regions where Richard Hayes operated. She knew every price fluctuation, every government policy, every investment trend. More importantly, she knew all the weaknesses in Hayes's empire which, although still powerful, was beginning to show cracks due to imprudent decisions and the growing arrogance of its owner. "The agricultural market has always been my specialty, Mr. Cooper. I grew up on a small rural property," replied Emily, the half-truth coming easily. "I understand not just the numbers, but the realities of the sector." The meeting proceeded for 2 hours. Emily presented brilliant analyses, identified opportunities Cooper hadn't considered, demonstrated intimate knowledge of large rural landowners' operations. She didn't directly mention Richard Hayes, but ensured his name emerged naturally in the conversation. Cooper was visibly impressed, taking frequent notes and asking increasingly specific questions, which Emily answered with precision and confidence. When they finally finished, Cooper closed his briefcase and looked directly at Emily. "You're not like the other analysts I've interviewed, Miss Winters," he said, leaning slightly forward. "They understand numbers and trends. You seem to understand people and motivations. It's a much more valuable skill." Emily allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It was exactly what she wanted to hear. In recent years, she had studied not just finance and markets, but psychology and manipulation. She learned to read people, to identify their weaknesses and desires, to present herself exactly in the way that would be most attractive to them. Michael Cooper was known to value instinct as much as technical analysis. She had shaped her presentation specifically to appeal to this characteristic. "The market is made by people, Mr. Cooper. Understanding their fears and ambitions is as important as understanding balance sheets and projections," Emily replied, closing her laptop. "The best investments come from understanding what others don't see or don't want to see." Cooper studied Emily for a moment before making his decision. He took out a business card and slid it across the table. It wasn't an ordinary card. It had no phone number or address, just his name and a private email address. Emily immediately recognized the significance. Cooper was offering more than a job. He was offering mentorship, a gateway into an exclusive circle of power and influence. "You start on Monday. My assistant will send the details," said Cooper, standing up. "I'm curious to see how far you can go, Miss Winters." After Cooper's departure, Emily remained at the cafe for another hour, planning her next steps. The job with Cooper was perfect. He not only had the resources and contacts she needed, but also a reputation for aggressive investment methods that bordered on illegality without ever completely crossing the line. Exactly the kind of knowledge she would need for her revenge. Emily paid the bill and walked out into the busy street, feeling closer to her goal than ever. One step at a time, Emily thought, as she walked to her small apartment. Patience is the key to perfect revenge. The following years passed in a blur of intense work, constant learning, and meticulous planning. Emily quickly rose in Cooper's company, becoming his most trusted analyst and, eventually, his partner in special operations. She learned the darkest aspects of the financial world: how to manipulate valuations, how to pressure struggling companies, how to acquire valuable assets for fractions of their real value, all while maintaining an impeccable reputation in the market, known for her sharp intelligence and irreproachable work ethic. Few knew that behind the professional facade, Emily remained obsessed with a single goal. "Should I inform Miss Peterson that you won't be attending her party again?" asked Emily's assistant, referring to an important social event. "It's the 3rd invitation this month that you've declined." "Tell her I'm focused on a special project," Emily replied without taking her eyes off her computer screen. "I'm sure she'll understand." The truth was that Emily had no time for socializing. Every free minute was dedicated to monitoring Richard Hayes and his business dealings. She had created a complete dossier on him, his properties, his debts, his associates, his secrets. She knew he had overextended his operations in recent years, leveraging his properties with risky loans to finance an increasingly extravagant lifestyle. She also knew that the recent drought and changes in agricultural policies had severely affected him. Hayes was vulnerable, for the first time in decades. It's almost ironic, Emily thought, reviewing the latest financial reports of Hayes's main company. He killed my father for a piece of land, and now he's about to lose everything through his own greed. It was an ordinary work afternoon when Emily received the email she had waited for so long. A contact she had carefully cultivated, a bank employee who supervised Hayes's loans, sent her a short but significant message. RH urgently seeking investor. Critical situation. 30-day deadline for reorganization or mortgage foreclosure. Attached was a confidential memo detailing the extent of Hayes's financial crisis. He was on the brink of bankruptcy, desperate for a capital partner who could inject enough money to save his collapsing empire. Emily read the email several times, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. 10 years of preparation, of patient waiting, of meticulously building her position and resources. 10 years dreaming of this moment, visualizing what it would be like to finally be able to implement her revenge. And now, the moment had arrived. Richard Hayes was exactly where she wanted him. Desperate, vulnerable, ready to accept help from anyone who could save him from complete ruin, including an unknown investor who appeared at the right time with the right proposal. "The time has come," Emily whispered, closing her laptop and walking to her office window. She observed the city below, the hurried people, each absorbed in their own lives, with no idea of the drama that was about to unfold. "The time has come, Father." Emily's car glided smoothly along the dusty rural road, approaching the place that had haunted her nightmares for a decade. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she spotted the imposing wrought-iron gates with the intertwined initials RH. A bronze plaque announced Hayes Ranch, as if declaring a small kingdom. Emily took a deep breath, adjusting the rearview mirror to check her appearance one last time. Her face was unrecognizable. She had dyed her hair golden blonde, wore contact lenses that transformed her brown eyes into a piercing blue, and had refined her features with professional makeup techniques. More than her physical appearance, she had transformed her way of speaking, her walk, even her gestures. Amanda Reynolds, the identity she had created, was a completely different woman from Emily Winters. "Remember, you are no longer that frightened girl," she murmured to herself, adjusting the elegant women's suit she was wearing. "You are Amanda Reynolds, and Richard Hayes is just another desperate client who needs your help." As she passed through the gates, Emily immediately noticed the changes in the property. What was once a prosperous farm now showed clear signs of neglect. Fences needed repairs, auxiliary buildings had peeling paint, and some fields seemed abandoned. A discreet smile appeared on her lips. The financial reports didn't lie. Hayes's empire was truly crumbling. Emily parked in front of the main mansion, an impressive two-story structure, with imposing columns and wide porches. It was a physical manifestation of Richard's arrogance, built with money from stolen lands and destroyed lives, including hers. She grabbed her leather portfolio, took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her posture perfectly straight, exuding confidence and competence. "Miss Reynolds, welcome to Hayes Ranch," said a middle-aged man, clearly not Richard, approaching to receive her. "I'm Peter, Mr. Hayes's personal assistant. He's eager to meet you and discuss your proposal." The mansion inside was even more opulent than Emily had imagined. Antique furniture, Persian rugs, expensive artwork. Everything screamed wealth and privilege. Emily observed every detail as she followed Peter through the corridors, noticing small signs of decay that a less trained eye wouldn't catch. Subtle cracks in walls disguised by paintings, moisture stains in corners of ornate ceilings, slightly worn furniture. The house, like its owner, struggled to maintain an appearance of prosperity that no longer existed. Peter led her to a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of fields and distant mountains. In the center, standing next to a solid wooden table covered with maps and documents, was Richard Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Amanda Reynolds, from Reynolds Financial Consulting," announced Peter, before discreetly withdrawing. Richard Hayes had aged, but maintained the dominant presence Emily remembered. At 60, his hair was completely grey, but still abundant and well-groomed. Lines of worry marked his face, especially around the eyes that once conveyed only coldness and now revealed a touch of anxiety. He was impeccably dressed in a custom-made suit, but Emily noticed the watch on his wrist was the same from 10 years ago. A small detail confirming his financial liquidity was compromised. Richard advanced with his hand extended, a rehearsed smile on his face. "Miss Reynolds, your reputation precedes you," he said, shaking her hand with excessive firmness, an old trick to establish dominance that Emily knew well. "Michael Cooper spoke very highly of your abilities. The pleasure is mine, Mr. Hayes. Michael mentioned that your situation requires creative and immediate solutions," Emily responded, her tone professional and neutral, returning the handshake with equal firmness. "I'm here to see how I can help." Emily had carefully orchestrated this introduction through Michael Cooper, who genuinely believed he was helping an old acquaintance by recommending his brilliant protégé. Cooper had no idea he was being used as a pawn in Emily's meticulous game. The meeting began formally, with Richard trying to minimize the severity of his financial situation, while Emily pretended to believe his evasions. She let him maintain this facade for some time, observing how his ego struggled against the reality of his desperate position. After almost an hour of superficial discussions, Emily opened her briefcase and placed on the table a document she had prepared, a detailed analysis of Hayes's finances that revealed the true critical state of his business. "With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, I'm not here to discuss the problem you want me to see, but the problem that actually exists," said Emily, her voice firm but not confrontational. "You have less than 30 days before the banks foreclose on your main properties." Richard's face hardened, his gaze fixed on the document that exposed his vulnerability. For a moment, Emily saw the same fury she had witnessed that fateful night 10 years ago. His fists briefly clenched before he regained control. The silence that followed was tense, laden with wounded pride and barely contained desperation. Finally, Richard looked up at her, and Emily realized she had passed the first test. He had decided he needed her more than he needed his facade of invulnerability. "Impressive, Miss Reynolds." "And disturbingly accurate," admitted Richard, leaning back in his chair. "The question is, now that you've identified the problem, what solution do you propose?" Emily smiled internally. The moment to cast the bait had arrived. She removed another document from her briefcase, this one containing her detailed proposal. On the surface, it appeared to be a brilliant solution. A complete debt restructuring, injection of new capital, strategic refinancing, all packaged in terms that seemed extremely favorable to Hayes. What wasn't explicit, but carefully hidden in the legal fine print, were clauses that would gradually transfer operational control and, eventually, ownership of the most valuable assets to the shell company Emily had created. She knew that Richard, in his desperation and arrogance, wouldn't examine the details with the necessary care. "My proposal is simple, but effective," explained Emily, pointing to the main points of the document. "I create a new holding company to consolidate your assets. I inject enough capital to satisfy your most immediate creditors, renegotiate your loans based on my financial credibility. In short, I stabilize the ship before it sinks, allowing you to remain in command while I work behind the scenes." "And what do you get out of this, besides consulting fees?" asked Richard, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Nobody offers help of this caliber without wanting a considerable slice of the pie." The meeting stretched for hours, with Richard questioning every aspect of the proposal, and Emily responding with a combination of technical expertise and carefully calibrated psychological persuasion. She knew exactly when to yield on minor points to build trust, when to show firm conviction to impress, and when to appeal to his ego. By late afternoon, Richard was not only convinced of the proposal, but beginning to see Emily as his savior, someone who understood his vision and valued the empire he had built. It was exactly where she wanted him to be, grateful, relieved, and completely deceived. "I'll need to stay in the area for a few weeks to implement these initial changes," said Emily, collecting her documents after Richard finally agreed to the main terms. "I recommend we begin immediately." "Naturally, you'll stay here at the mansion," Richard replied with a smile that tried to be charming, but which Emily recognized as predatory. "I have several guest rooms, and you can work in the office adjacent to the library." After the meeting, Richard insisted on personally showing Emily the property. They left the mansion for a tour of the vast ranch grounds in a utility vehicle. Emily observed everything with analytical eyes, noting both the potential and the neglect. Richard proudly narrated the history of how he had expanded what was initially a modest property into the current empire, conveniently omitting how he had acquired many of the lands through questionable tactics. As they drove, Emily recognized landmarks from her childhood now transformed, some almost unrecognizable after a decade. Her heart accelerated when she realized where they were heading. "And here we have the most recent expansion area," said Richard, stopping the vehicle at the top of a small hill. 10 years ago, I acquired this property from a stubborn farmer who didn't recognize its true potential. Now it's one of the most productive areas of the ranch." Emily felt her stomach turn as she recognized exactly where they were, her father's land, the place where her life had been destroyed. The foundation of the house was still vaguely visible, covered by vegetation and years of abandonment. Almost in the same spot where her father had been murdered, Richard had built a small lookout from which he supervised work in the adjacent fields. The calculated cruelty of it, transforming the site of a murder into an observation point for the murderer, almost broke Emily's composure. Her fingers tightened discreetly in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. "Fascinating how you transformed this area," she managed to say, her voice perfectly controlled despite the internal emotional storm. "The former owner certainly didn't have your business vision." "Some men are too small to manage large lands," Richard replied, with a dismissive shrug. "It's the law of nature that the weak give way to the strong." Back at the mansion late in the afternoon, Emily was led to her room by an elderly woman with an upright posture and severe expression. Martha, the head housekeeper, had worked for the Hayes family for more than 3 decades and clearly commanded the domestic staff with a firm hand. As they walked through the corridors, Emily felt the woman's attentive eyes analyzing her. There was something in Martha's gaze that put her on alert, a shrewdness that contrasted with her servile position. Upon reaching the designated room, a spacious suite with elegant but somewhat outdated decor, Martha remained at the door after showing the accommodations, as if wanting to say something. "Miss Reynolds, allow me an observation," Martha finally said, her tone formal but with an underlying intensity. "I've worked for the Hayes family for a long time and have seen many consultants, lawyers, and specialists come through here. Most leave empty-handed or worse. I appreciate the warning, Martha, but I believe my situation is a bit different," Emily responded, keeping a light tone while carefully observing the housekeeper's reaction. "Mr. Hayes and I have aligned interests at the moment." "That's exactly what they all think at the beginning," Martha retorted, her eyes never leaving Emily's. "In any case, if you need anything, my quarters are at the end of the ground floor corridor near the kitchen." The following weeks were of intense activity. Emily quickly implemented the first phases of her plan, temporarily stabilizing Hayes's financial situation through negotiations with banks and creditors. Each seemingly beneficial move for Richard contained carefully hidden traps that would only reveal themselves later. In meetings with lawyers and accountants, she was brilliant and persuasive, gaining the trust not only of Richard but of his entire professional circle. In the dinners and social events that followed, she charmed Richard's associates with her intelligence and false modesty, becoming indispensable. "You are truly exceptional, Amanda," Richard commented during a private dinner after a particularly successful negotiation. "In just 3 weeks, you've achieved what my lawyers said was impossible." "I just did what any good financial consultant would do, Richard," Emily replied, allowing herself to use his first name, an intimacy she had carefully avoided until then. "The difference is that I believe in this ranch's potential, and in you." The lie slipped easily from her lips, and Emily observed with satisfaction how Richard's ego inflated with the praise. It was fascinating and repulsive to see how the man who had destroyed her family was so easily manipulated by simple validation. During those weeks, Emily noticed how Martha constantly observed her eyes following her through the rooms, her expression alternating between suspicion and something that seemed almost like recognition. On several occasions, Emily caught the housekeeper studying her face when she thought she wasn't being watched. It was unsettling, but Emily could do nothing but maintain her impeccable persona. "There's something familiar about you, Miss Reynolds," Martha said one afternoon, while Emily worked alone in the library. Your eyes remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. I have one of those common faces, I suppose, Emily replied casually, without taking her eyes off the documents she was analyzing. People always say I look like someone they've known. No, it's not that, Martha insisted, placing a tea tray on the table with more force than necessary. It's something in the way you observe everything, as if you were memorizing every detail to use later. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the dynamic between Emily and Richard subtly changed. He began to seek her company not just for business matters, but during meals, horseback rides around the property, even asking for her opinion on personal matters. Emily recognized the signs. He was developing feelings for her exactly as she had planned. It was a fine line to walk, encourage him enough to advance her plan, but maintain emotional distance for her own sanity. Each casual touch she had to endure, each smile she had to force when he came too close, were small sacrifices for her greater revenge. You know, Amanda, I've begun to see the ranch differently since you arrived, Richard confessed during a candle-lit dinner he had insisted on arranging. For years, I saw it only as an empire to be expanded. Now I realize I needed someone to share it with. It's a magnificent property, Richard, Emily replied, taking a sip of wine to hide her disgust. You've built something truly impressive here. As Emily's influence over Richard grew, so did Martha's suspicion. The housekeeper began asking the staff questions about Emily's activities, checking her background, observing her phone conversations. Emily, always vigilant, noticed all of this and took double care with every move. In a silent game of cat and mouse, the two women circled each other, each one suspicious but never directly confronting. Emily knew that Martha represented the greatest risk to her plan, the only person on the property who seemed to see beyond Amanda Reynolds's facade. Mr. Hayes seems quite taken with you, Martha commented one day while tidying Emily's room when she thought she was out. She didn't notice Emily returning silently. Martha, I didn't know you were here, said Emily, making the housekeeper turn abruptly. Any problem with the room? No, Miss Reynolds. Just checking if everything is in order, Martha replied, her gaze briefly shifting to the bedside table drawer she had just closed. As I said, Mr. Hayes is very invested in your consultancy. 6 months after her arrival at the ranch, Emily had completed most of her preparatory plan. Hayes's companies were apparently stabilized, but secretly compromised by agreements she had orchestrated. The operational control of several key assets was already discreetly under her influence. Legal documents were prepared, requiring only a few strategic signatures to definitively transfer ownership. Everything was ready for the final move. But Emily did not expect what happened on an October night. Richard invited her to a special dinner on the mansion's terrace, overlooking the fields now recovered thanks to Emily's apparent work. The table was elegantly decorated with flowers, candles, and fine porcelain. A hired musician played piano softly in the background. It was clearly a carefully planned occasion. As they dined, Richard spoke animatedly about the future, about new projects for the ranch, always including Emily in every vision. She maintained her rehearsed smile, agreeing at the right moments, offering calculated suggestions she knew he would approve of. When dessert was served, Richard gave a discreet signal, and the musician and servants withdrew, leaving them alone under the starry sky. Amanda, these last few months have been transformative for me and for the ranch, Richard began, his voice softer than usual. You haven't just saved my business, but brought something I didn't realize was missing in my life. Emily felt an internal alarm trigger. She had foreseen this moment, but not so soon. Richard rose from his chair and, to her momentary horror, knelt beside her, removing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Inside, a gleaming diamond ring captured the candlelight. Ostentatious, expensive, and, to Emily, a physical representation of all the corruption and cruelty he personified. I know it may seem sudden, but at our age it doesn't make sense to wait when you're certain, continued Richard, taking her hand. Amanda Reynolds, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The world seemed to freeze for an instant. All of Emily's mental preparation, all the years of planning culminated in this moment. The irony was almost suffocating. The man who had taken everything from her now offered all he possessed, without knowing who she really was. A distant part of her mind registered that this proposal considerably accelerated her plan. As Richard's wife, Her access and control would be practically absolute. Forcing the most convincing smile she could muster, Emily allowed fake tears of joy to shine in her eyes. "Richard, I'm speechless," she responded, her voice deliberately choked with emotion. "Yes, I accept." Later that night, after hours of false celebration, Emily finally retired to her room. She locked the door, checked that the curtains were completely closed, and only then allowed her mask to fall. Her body trembled with the intensity of repressed emotions, disgust, triumph, determination, all mixed in an internal storm. From her carefully locked suitcase, Emily retrieved the only personal item she had brought with her, an aged photograph of her father, kept in a small silver frame. She looked long at the smiling face of the man Richard had murdered, tracing the contours of the portrait with trembling fingers. "The first part is complete, Father," Emily whispered to the photograph, a cold smile forming on her lips. "Soon he will lose everything, just as he made me lose you." The grand hall of the Hayes mansion gleamed with the light of dozens of crystal chandeliers, illuminating the smiling faces of the local elite gathered to celebrate the first wedding anniversary of Richard and Amanda Hayes. Dressed in an elegant navy blue silk dress that enhanced her eyes, Emily circulated among the guests with a perfectly rehearsed smile, accepting congratulations and playing the role of devoted wife with meticulous precision. Her arm was intertwined with Richard's, who displayed his beautiful wife like another valuable acquisition in his collection of trophies. Behind that facade of happy union, Emily felt the painful grip of his fingers on her arm, constantly reminding her of who was in control. In recent months, the mask of chivalry that Richard had worn during their courtship had completely disintegrated, revealing the cruel and controlling man she had always known he was. The fairy tale that guests believed they were witnessing was in reality a carefully orchestrated nightmare. "Isn't that right, dear?" Richard interrupted her thoughts, his voice loaded with false affability as he addressed her before a group of local investors. "Amanda has been the true person responsible for the turnaround of our finances in the last year." "Richard exaggerates," Emily replied, tilting her head slightly in a studied gesture of modesty. "I just helped highlight the potential that already existed in his properties." As soon as the guests moved away to get more champagne, Richard's smile disappeared. Pulling her to a less crowded corner of the room, he whispered through gritted teeth, "Stop contradicting my statements. When I say you saved the finances, you agree and thank me. You're making me look like a liar in front of my associates." His words were accompanied by an even tighter grip on her arm, which would certainly leave marks to join the collection of bruises she skillfully hid under long-sleeved clothes. "I just thought it would be more convincing to show some modesty, Richard," Emily explained, keeping her voice calm despite the pain. "Men like a wife who doesn't seek the spotlight." The transformation in Richard's behavior after the wedding hadn't surprised Emily, but the speed and intensity with which it occurred exceeded even her expectations. The honeymoon, a week at a luxury resort, had barely ended when the first outburst of anger happened. An apparently innocent comment about a business decision resulted in a torrent of insults, followed by a whiskey glass thrown against the wall inches from her head. In the months that followed, the pattern was established. In public, Richard was the devoted and proud husband. In private, he was a tyrant who controlled every aspect of Emily's life, from the clothes she wore to the people she could talk to. The verbal humiliations were constant, the physical aggressions increasingly frequent. For any other woman, the situation would be unbearable. For Emily, it was merely fuel for her revenge. "You think I didn't notice how the Carson's son looked at you during dinner last week?" Richard accused one night, bursting into the room where Emily was reading. "You were practically offering yourself to him with that indecent dress." "Richard, the dress was chosen by you yourself," Emily responded calmly, marking the page of the book before closing it. "And I exchanged less than 10 words with the young man, all about the irrigation project you wanted to discuss." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, snatching the book from her hands and throwing it against the wall. "You think I don't see through this perfect wife facade of yours? You would be nothing without me, Amanda. You were just a mediocre financial consultant when I found you." Every insult, every unjust accusation, every outburst of anger was meticulously recorded in Emily's memory, fueling her determination. During the day when Richard was busy with the farm business, she used her position as wife to explore every corner of the mansion and adjacent properties. Her unrestricted access as the lady of the house allowed her to examine documents, listen to conversations, and gradually build a mental map of Richard's illicit activities. She discovered records of bribes to public officials, evidence of intimidation of small landowners, falsified property documents, including those of her father's land. Each discovery was carefully photographed or copied, forming an arsenal for the right moment. At the same time, using the financial knowledge that Richard valued so much, she began to discreetly sabotage his operations, redirecting small amounts to accounts he was unaware of, inserting strategic errors in important contracts, delaying payments to specific creditors. "I don't understand why negotiations with the cooperative are stagnant," Richard complained during dinner, slamming his fist on the table and making the cutlery jump. "I offered perfectly reasonable conditions." "Perhaps they received contradictory information," Emily suggested, taking a sip of wine to hide her smile. "I should review the proposal tomorrow to see if there was some misunderstanding." "Do that. And make sure they understand that I don't have time to waste on ignorant farmers who don't recognize a good offer when they see one." Emily watched Richard carefully as he devoured his dinner, unaware that his wife had secretly sabotaged the deal with the cooperative. The irony was that even with all the humiliations and abuses, Richard still fully trusted Emily's financial abilities. It was his arrogance that blinded him, the certainty that a woman he completely dominated would never have the courage or ability to challenge him. This same arrogance prevented him from realizing that the solutions she found for the problems she herself created frequently resulted in greater dependence on her and gradual loss of control on his part. While Richard humiliated her, Emily slowly dismantled his empire piece by piece in such a subtle way that he didn't even notice. "The bank is questioning the loan guarantees for the Western expansion," informed Emily, entering Richard's office with a folder of documents. "Apparently, there are discrepancies in the land appraisals." "Impossible!" "I paid good money to ensure those appraisals were adequate," replied Richard, stopping abruptly upon realizing what he was about to admit. "I mean, I hired the best appraisers in the region." "Of course you did," agreed Emily, her neutral tone hiding the triumph of having secretly recorded yet another confession of fraud. "Fortunately, I have an alternative solution that won't require a complete reappraisal." During the months of marriage, a constant figure silently observed the dynamics between the couple: Martha, the housekeeper. The woman's initial distrust of Emily had intensified, her eyes following her when she believed she wasn't being watched. Several times, Emily noticed Martha examining the drawers of her personal office, or discreetly questioning the staff about her activities. It was just a matter of time until the situation reached a confrontation, and it finally happened on a rainy afternoon when Richard was away from the property for a meeting in town. Emily was in her office, reviewing documents that incriminated Richard in an illegal land appropriation scheme, when she felt a presence at the door. She looked up to find Martha standing there, observing her with an expression impossible to decipher. The housekeeper entered without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind her. For a tense moment, the two women just stared at each other in silence. Emily knew this moment could determine the success or failure of her entire revenge plan. "I finally discovered why you seem so familiar to me, Mrs. Hayes," said Martha, pronouncing the surname with evident disdain. "Your eyes may have changed color, your hair may have a new shade, but there are things that no disguise can hide." "I don't know what you're talking about, Martha," Emily responded calmly, although her heart was racing. "If something is bothering you, I'd prefer you to be direct." "Very well, I'll be direct." "You are Thomas Winter's daughter," Martha stated, carefully observing Emily's reaction. "The girl who disappeared after the tragic accident that killed your father, exactly in that area that Richard so likes to show visitors." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's mind was racing, quickly evaluating her options. Denying would be useless. Martha clearly was certain of her claim. Admitting could be dangerous, but also potentially advantageous, depending on the housekeeper's true intentions. What surprised her most was Martha's tone. There was no accusation, just a strange mixture of admiration and bitterness. "How did you figure it out?" Emily finally asked, Deciding that calculated honesty would be her best approach, I thought my disguise was impeccable. "It was your gesture when drinking tea," explained Martha, sitting in the chair across from the desk without being invited. "Exactly like your mother used to do, the thumb and index finger holding the cup in a very specific way. I knew your parents, girl. I served in this house when they were still respected neighbors before Richard changed everything." The revelation triggered a wave of emotions in Emily. Her mother had passed away when she was only 6, and the memories were scarce and precious. The idea that she unconsciously carried one of her gestures touched something deep in her heart, something she had kept buried for years to survive her mission. Recognizing the momentary vulnerability, she forced herself to regain composure, staying focused on the danger and opportunity that Martha represented. "What do you intend to do with this information?" asked Emily, her tone now cold and calculating. "Will you tell Richard that his beloved wife is actually the daughter of the man he murdered?" "Murdered? So you know." Martha let the phrase hang in the air, her eyes narrowing. "I thought it was just a suspicion of yours. Few know what really happened that night." "I was there," confessed Emily, the words coming out like long-contained poison, hidden, watching as Richard took my father's life and then bought the police's silence. "I saw everything." Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of that revelation. When she opened them again, there was a determination that Emily hadn't seen before. The housekeeper rose and walked to the window, observing the rain falling on the verdant fields that had once belonged to so many families, now displaced by Richard's greed. "I don't intend to tell Richard," she finally said, turning to face Emily. "In fact, I want to help you." It was Emily's turn to be surprised. Of all possible reactions, this was the one I least expected. She studied the woman in front of her, now noticing signs of a beauty that time and hardship had worn down, but not completely eliminated. There was a story there, a story of pain that somehow connected to her own. "Why would you help me destroy the man you've worked for decades?" Emily questioned, genuinely curious. "Because Richard Hayes destroyed my life as much as he destroyed yours," Martha replied, her voice carrying an old resentment. "I wasn't always the housekeeper, you know. 30 years ago I was his lover, young and naive enough to believe his promises of love. What followed was a painful confession that even Emily, with all her meticulous research on Richard, had never discovered. Martha had been the daughter of one of the ranch's first employees, a beautiful young woman who caught Richard's attention when he was still building his empire. He seduced her with promises of marriage and a life of luxury, keeping their relationship secret for almost 2 years. When Martha became pregnant, Richard showed his true nature. He forced her to have an abortion under precarious conditions that nearly killed her and left her unable to have other children, then kept her at the ranch as a housekeeper, a constant reminder of her place and a way to ensure her silence through financial dependence. "I could have left, of course," Martha concluded, her voice now a whisper laden with decades of resentment. "But I stayed to see his downfall. I hoped that someday, somehow, he would pay for everything. And now, you're here." The two women studied each other for a long moment, recognizing in each other the same determination forged by suffering. On that rainy afternoon, an unlikely alliance was born. The vengeful young wife and the bitter housekeeper, united by their shared desire for justice. Martha knew every corner of the mansion, every secret Richard believed was well kept, every routine and weakness of the man who had ruined their lives. This knowledge, combined with Emily's privileged access and financial cunning, formed a potent weapon. "He has a secret safe behind the painting in the main office," Martha revealed, leaning in closer. "The combination is the date he bought his first large property. That's where he keeps documents he would never show anyone, not even you." "And you know this combination?" asked Emily, already calculating how she could use this information. "I know many things, girl. 30 years of silent observation teach a determined woman a lot," Martha replied with a melancholic smile. "The question is, what exactly is your plan? Because if you came just to kill him, there are simpler ways than marrying him." In the months that followed, Martha became Emily's most valuable ally. As head housekeeper, she could freely move around the property without raising suspicion, obtaining information, intercepting compromising correspondence, altering small details of Richard's routine to facilitate Emily's maneuvers. More importantly, Martha served as Emily's eyes and ears when Richard believed he was alone, reporting suspicious phone conversations, secret meetings with associates of dubious reputation, moments of weakness and concern that he would never show his wife. "He has a meeting tomorrow with the retired sheriff," Martha informed during one of their secret conversations in the greenhouse, where the noise of the fans prevented them from being heard. "The same man who investigated your father's death. Apparently he's demanding more money to keep his silence about something related to old land acquisitions." "Perfect," Emily replied, noting the information in a small, coded notebook. "Can you find out where and when exactly?" "I already know. At the old equipment shed at 2 in the afternoon. Richard always uses that location for meetings he doesn't want recorded in the property records." Richard's humiliations and abuses continued, intensifying over time. His paranoia grew proportionally to the mysterious problems that emerged in his business, problems carefully orchestrated by Emily. He began to drink more heavily, lose control more frequently, make mistakes that an experienced businessman would never make. Emily endured everything with almost superhuman patience, each new abuse only strengthening her resolution. "You're sabotaging me, aren't you?" Richard accused during a particularly tense dinner, after discovering that an important contract had been lost due to a poorly written clause. "It's the only explanation for so many consecutive problems." "Richard, if I wanted to sabotage your business, why would I work so hard to fix it afterward?" Emily replied with practiced calm. "I'm your wife. Your success is my success." "Maybe you're just incompetent," he retorted, hurling the plate against the wall in a fit of rage. "A fraud who managed to deceive me with a pretty face and empty promises." That night, the abuse reached a new level, leaving Emily with visible marks that not even her skillful makeup could completely hide. The next morning, while covering a bruise on her face with foundation, she met Martha's gaze in the mirror. No words were necessary. The housekeeper simply nodded, a silent agreement that time was running out, that the final phase of the plan needed to be accelerated. Emily returned the nod, the cold calculation in her eyes momentarily replacing the mask of the submissive wife. "A grand party," Richard announced during breakfast a week later, surprisingly animated after days of dark mood. "To celebrate the new partnership with the Carson Group. I want all the important businessmen in the region here next Saturday." "Certainly, dear," Emily agreed, exchanging a quick glance with Martha, who was serving coffee. "I'll take care of all the preparations." The party would be the perfect opportunity to advance the plan. With the mansion full of guests, Richard's attention divided, Emily could implement the next steps without raising suspicions. What she didn't expect, however, was the announcement Richard made later that day when he returned from a trip to town. "I hired some temporary staff to help with the party preparations," he commented casually, while reviewing correspondence in his office, including a foreman to supervise the setup of tents and stages in the garden. "An experienced man worked here many years ago. Jack Miller, I think that's his name." The name hit Emily like a physical blow. Jack Miller had been Richard's head foreman at the time her father was murdered, one of the men present on that fateful night. She had included him in her research on Richard's past, but information indicated he had moved to another state years ago. Her mind raced, calculating risks and possibilities. Miller had known her as a child before the murder. Unlike Richard, who had only seen her briefly from a distance, Miller had interacted with her on several occasions when visiting her father's property with Richard to negotiate. The chance of being recognized was significant, especially considering that her eyes, even with contact lenses, maintained the same shape and expression. "Seems like a great idea," she finally responded, keeping her voice neutral despite the internal turmoil. "I'll coordinate with him on the arrangement of tables and chairs." On the night of the party, the Hayes mansion gleamed with lights and music. The local elite circulated through the decorated halls and gardens, celebrating what Richard announced as the beginning of a new era of prosperity for the ranch. Emily, stunning in a red dress that deliberately drew attention, moved among the guests as the perfect hostess, always by her husband's side, always smiling, always vigilant. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, looking for Jack Miller, mentally preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It was during a toast in the Great Hall that she finally saw him. Jack Miller stood at the back, along with other temporary staff observing the celebration, He was a 60-year-old man, grey hair, face marked by sun and hard work, but Emily recognized him instantly. And at the exact moment their eyes met across the crowded hall, she knew by the way he froze, by the sudden paleness in his face, that he had recognized her too. The glass he was holding stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened in shock and confusion. "Is everything all right, dear?" asked Richard, noticing her momentary tension. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired of smiling so much," Emily replied, forcing herself to look away from Miller. "I think I need some fresh air." For the rest of the evening, Emily felt Miller's eyes following her, studying her, confirming his suspicions. She carefully maneuvered to avoid being alone, always surrounded by guests or staff, aware that a premature confrontation with Miller could ruin everything. But as the party progressed and guests began to leave, the inevitable confrontation approached. It was Martha who alerted Emily, discreetly approaching as she said goodbye to the last guests. "The new man Miller is waiting in the side corridor near the greenhouse," whispered the housekeeper. "Said he needs to talk to you about an urgent matter related to decoration." His eyes don't match his words. With a racing heart but a clear mind, Emily waited until Richard was distracted with a group of investors before sliding into the indicated hallway. As Martha had said, Jack Miller was waiting there alone, his tense posture revealing nervousness and confusion. When she approached, he turned and their eyes met again, his full of questions, hers calculating every possible move in this new and dangerous game. "I thought I was seeing things," Miller finally said, his voice low and rough. "But now, seeing you up close, you've grown, Thomas's daughter, but your eyes remain the same." Emily felt the world freeze for a moment as she faced Jack Miller in the deserted corridor of the Hayes mansion. The recognition in his words confirmed her worst fear. Her identity was at risk. Maintaining the exterior calm she had cultivated for years, Emily indicated a nearby door leading to the rarely used small library. She quickly checked the corridor to ensure no one was watching them before ushering Jack into the darkened room, turning on only a small lamp that cast unsettling shadows across the dusty bookshelves. The former foreman seemed simultaneously frightened and fascinated, as if standing before a ghost. Emily closed the door silently and turned to face him, calculating every word of her response. "You're confusing me with someone else, Mr. Miller," said Emily, her voice cold and controlled. "My name is Amanda Hayes, and I've never been in this region before meeting my husband." "Don't insult my intelligence, girl," Jack replied, his voice harsh but low, aware of the need for discretion. "I may have aged, but my eyes and memory still work. I stood beside Richard when he visited your father several times. I saw you hiding, observing our conversations, and that last night, I was there too. I didn't participate directly, but I saw what happened. I saw you dragging your father's body out of the burning house. I thought you had died too or disappeared forever, and now I find you here married to the man who killed your father. What kind of dangerous game are you playing?" Denial would be useless. Emily studied Jack's wrinkled face, looking for signs of his true intentions. There was no apparent hostility, but also no guarantee of loyalty. Deciding to risk a half-truth, Emily adjusted her strategy. She needed to neutralize this threat immediately, before Richard noticed something wrong. The party was still happening a few meters away, and her prolonged absence would soon be noticed. "I came to seek justice for my father's murder," she finally admitted, keeping her eyes fixed on his. "I spent 10 years preparing for this moment, building a new identity, learning necessary skills. Richard Hayes destroyed my family and stole our lands. He deserves to pay for his crimes." "My God, girl, you don't know who you're dealing with," whispered Jack, running his hand through his grey hair in a nervous gesture. "Richard is not just a murderer. He's ruthless, has connections everywhere. If he discovers who you are..." The conversation was interrupted by footsteps nearby in the hallway. Emily reacted quickly, grabbing a random book from the shelf and opening it on the small table between them. When the door opened, Martha was standing there, her face a mask of professional efficiency that disguised the relief at seeing Emily was still safe. The housekeeper entered, closing the door behind her. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband is looking for you," Martha announced formally in case anyone was listening. Then, lowering her voice, "Richard has started asking about your absence and noticed that Miller is also missing. We need to act quickly." In the days following that first confrontation, A complicated dynamic began to develop. Jack Miller initially showed solidarity, expressing genuine remorse for his passive participation in the events that led to Thomas's death. During carefully orchestrated meetings in remote corners of the property, always watched over by Martha to ensure they weren't discovered, Jack offered valuable information about Richard's past criminal activities that could strengthen Emily's plan. However, as the weeks passed, the nature of these interactions subtly changed. Expressions of guilt gave way to increasingly clear hints about his precarious financial situation. The tone of their conversations became progressively more demanding, until, during a meeting in the old barn, he finally showed his true intentions. "I've been thinking, Emily. Sorry, Amanda," said Jack, his tone falsely casual while checking if they were really alone. "A man my age should be enjoying retirement, not working as a temporary foreman. Unfortunately, some bad investments have left me in a difficult situation, and now I carry this valuable secret about Mrs. Hayes's true identity." "Are you blackmailing me, Jack?" Emily asked directly, tired of the runaround. "After expressing so much remorse about what happened to my father." "Blackmail is such an ugly word," he replied, feigning offense. "I prefer to think of it as belated compensation for years of silence about the crime I witnessed. Consider it a mutually beneficial arrangement. I keep your secret. You provide an old man with a comfortable retirement. $50,000 would be a good start." Emily stared at the man before her, carefully hiding the fury she felt. Jack Miller was just another opportunist, not unlike Richard in his core values, just less successful in his ambitions. She needed to handle this complication quickly, but she also needed to be careful. Jack possessed knowledge that could destroy everything she had built. "And if I refuse?" she questioned, testing the limits of the threat. "What would happen then?" "It would be regrettable for everyone involved," Jack replied with a studiously casual shrug. "Richard would be furious to discover that his beloved wife is actually the daughter of the man he murdered. I can't imagine what he would do to you, or to me for keeping such a secret. That's why I really hope we can come to a friendly agreement." The next days transformed into a dangerous game of appearances. Emily needed to maintain her facade as a devoted wife in front of Richard, discreetly negotiate with Jack to buy time, and simultaneously accelerate her revenge plans before everything collapsed. Jack Miller's unannounced arrival had triggered a wave of paranoia in Richard. Emily noticed how his eyes followed each interaction between her and the foreman, how he suddenly appeared in conversations when the two were in the same environment, how he asked seemingly casual questions about her past. During a particularly tense dinner, Richard finally expressed his suspicions. "You and Miller seem quite familiar for people who just met," he commented, slowly swirling the whiskey in his glass, eyes fixed on her like a predator watching its prey. "Almost like old friends reuniting." "Hardly," Emily replied with a carefully calibrated laugh meant to sound carefree. "He just reminds me of my uncle, which makes it easier to talk to him about preparations for the charity event." "Why the sudden interest in a temporary employee?" "Curiosity, that's all," said Richard, but the dangerous gleam in his eyes contradicted his words. "It's my duty to know the people who work for me, and the people my wife spends time with." The next morning, Emily discovered through Martha that Richard had hired a private investigator to research his wife's past. The housekeeper had found the invoice on his desk, along with the name and contact information of the investigator, Peter Sullivan, a former police officer known for his unorthodox methods and his willingness to circumvent legalities in exchange for adequate compensation. With the noose tightening, Emily urgently met with Martha in the greenhouse, the only place on the property where the noise of the fans made it impossible for them to be recorded or overheard. "We need to accelerate everything," said Emily, her voice urgent as she handed Martha a folder containing detailed financial documents. "Richard has hired someone to investigate my past. It's only a matter of time until they discover discrepancies in Amanda Reynolds's history." "What can I do?" asked Martha, accepting the folder with determination in her wrinkled gaze. "Tell me what you need, and it will be done. First, we need to neutralize Jack Miller. $50,000 and a one-way ticket far from here. Second, we need to finalize the modified will. I have everything ready, but I need Richard to sign it without reading the details. And finally," Emily hesitated, lowering her voice even more, I need you to help me prepare the poison. The plan quickly took shape. With Martha's help, Emily carefully extracted and processed specific plants that grew in the most remote corners of the property. The housekeeper, with knowledge passed down through generations, guided her in preparing a compound that, when administered correctly, would cause progressive neurological damage without killing immediately, a substance practically impossible to detect in common toxicological exams. They worked during the night in the small abandoned greenhouse at the edge of the property, far from the watchful eyes of Richard's loyal staff. The process was delicate and dangerous, requiring absolute precision in measurements and preparation times. My grandmother was known for her knowledge of plants, Martha explained, while monitoring the distillation process with experienced eyes. Some for healing, others for different purposes. This particular extract, derived from a rare variation of belladonna that grows only in this region, gradually attacks the nervous system. The symptoms initially resemble stress or minor strokes, evolving into partial paralysis and eventual complete incapacitation. The victim remains conscious, able to understand everything around them, but imprisoned in their own body. Seems an appropriate punishment for a man who imprisoned so many with his power, remarked Emily, observing the yellowish liquid slowly dripping into the glass flask. How long does it take to take effect? The first symptoms will appear within hours, but the complete effect will take days to manifest. Enough time that any connection to a specific meal will be difficult to establish. While preparing the poison, Emily implemented the next stage of her plan, neutralizing Jack Miller. Using funds she had discreetly diverted from Richard's businesses over months, she gathered the $50,000 demanded. However, instead of simply paying the blackmail, she devised a more permanent strategy. During a seemingly casual meeting in the stables, Emily handed Jack an envelope containing half the promised amount and a very specific proposal. "There's another $50,000 waiting for you in a Cayman Islands account," Emily informed him, keeping her voice low while watching Jack eagerly count the money. "Along with new identity documents and a job at a rural property. Far from here, far from Richard Hayes, far from any connection to your past. 100,000 total. That's generous, I must admit," replied Jack, tucking the envelope inside his jacket. "But what guarantees I won't come back for more after I spend this? Because I've included detailed documents outlining your involvement in my father's murder and various other crimes committed under Richard's orders. If anything happens to me, or if you try to return with new demands, these documents will be automatically delivered to the authorities. Consider it an incentive for our agreement to be permanent." While handling the threat from Jack Miller, Emily also advanced the most crucial element of her plan, the modified will. As Richard's wife and co-manager of his businesses, she had access to the family attorney, Harold Turner, an elderly man who had served the Hayes family for decades. Over months, she had carefully cultivated his trust, impressing him with her legal and financial knowledge, suggesting small modifications to existing documents that benefited Richard, establishing herself as a trustworthy partner in family affairs. Now that trust would be instrumental for her final move. "Harold, we need to update Richard's will," Emily said during a private meeting in the attorney's office in town. "With the recent expansion of the businesses and new acquisitions, the current document is outdated. Richard is extremely busy with the crisis in the Western Division, so he asked me to handle this." "Certainly, Mrs. Hayes," the attorney replied, adjusting his glasses while examining the documents Emily had brought. "These modifications seem quite extensive. Normally, I would discuss this directly with Richard as well." "I understand your concern, Harold," Emily interrupted with a reassuring smile. "But you know Richard. Legal details bore him terribly. He trusts me to handle these matters now. Of course, he'll review and sign the final document, but he asked me to work out the details with you first." With the manipulation skills she had perfected over years, Emily gradually convinced the attorney to prepare exactly the type of document she needed, a will that, under the guise of protecting Richard's assets from potential legal proceedings related to recent negotiations, actually transferred complete control of his properties and businesses to her in case of incapacitation or death. The document was carefully structured, with complex legal language that obscured its true implications, burying the most important clauses under paragraphs of technical jargon that she knew Richard would never bother to fully decipher. "This seems like a rather standard legal document," commented Harold after finalizing the modifications requested. "But some of these clauses are unusual. I'm sure Richard will want to discuss them in detail." "Naturally, and I'm prepared to explain each one of them," Emily replied with calculated confidence. "He'll understand that they are necessary protective measures in the current business climate." The opportunity to obtain Richard's signature came sooner than Emily expected. Following her precise instructions, Martha had accidentally mixed up important correspondence, causing a letter from a major creditor to be delivered weeks late. This triggered exactly the crisis Emily needed. Richard was furious, worried, and most importantly, distracted. She strategically scheduled a meeting with the lawyer for the same afternoon that Richard needed to deal with angry creditors, ensuring his attention would be divided and his patience exhausted. "Richard, I know you're busy with the creditor situation, but we need to finalize the new will today," said Emily, entering his office where he was shouting on the phone to a bank manager. "Harold is waiting for your signatures on the documents so he can register them before the legal deadline." "Not now, Amanda," Richard exploded, covering the phone's microphone with his hand. "I'm trying to prevent half of our assets from being frozen." "That's exactly why we need to update the will today," Emily insisted with calculated urgency. "These new clauses will protect our personal assets if creditors decide to file lawsuits against the companies. Without this protection, we could lose everything, not just the businesses, but also the house, the lands." The mention of possibly losing his personal empire hit Richard exactly as Emily had planned. With attention divided between the financial crisis and the presented documents, he quickly reviewed the first pages, pausing only on paragraphs that Emily subtly highlighted, all harmless, all apparently protective of his interests. The crucial pages, containing clauses that effectively transferred total control to her, were turned quickly, presented as standard legal formalities that merely reiterated points already discussed. "Do I really need to read all these pages of legal jargon?" Richard asked irritably, already signing the first pages while continuing to glance at the muted phone where the bank manager was waiting. "I trust you and Harold have taken care of everything as we discussed." "Absolutely, Richard," Emily confirmed, keeping her face neutral as she watched the pen glide over each signature line. "It's exactly what we discussed. Maximum protection for our personal assets against any legal action against the companies." With the last signature, Richard practically threw the documents back to Emily, immediately returning to his phone call. She carefully organized the pages, discreetly checking that each signature line was filled before quietly leaving the office. In the hallway, she found Martha waiting with an anxious expression. A brief nod confirmed success. The second part of the plan was complete. The modified will now only needed to be processed, and Martha would accompany Emily to the lawyer's office to witness the signatures and ensure everything was properly formalized. "It's done," Emily whispered as they walked quickly down the hallway. "As soon as the will is registered, we'll be ready for the final phase." Everything was finally aligned. Jack Miller had left 2 days earlier, supposedly to visit a sick relative, but in reality boarding a flight to a destination from which he would never return. The will had been officially registered, with all necessary signatures and witnesses. The poison was prepared, stored in a small vial hidden in the false bottom of Emily's jewelry drawer. The date for the final dinner was decided. It would be the following night, an intimate dinner to celebrate Richard's birthday, an occasion where no one would question a special dish personally prepared by his dedicated wife. On the eve of the big day, Emily was in her personal office finalizing the last details, checking each element of her plan when the phone rang. It was almost midnight, too late for social calls. Richard was on a last-minute business trip to appease creditors and wouldn't return until the next morning, in time for the birthday dinner. With hesitation, Emily answered, keeping her voice low to avoid alerting the few staff members still awake in the mansion. "Mrs. Hayes? Or should I say, Miss Winters?" The male voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakably smug. "My name is Peter Sullivan. I believe your husband hired me to investigate certain inconsistencies in your past." Emily felt her blood run cold. The investigator had discovered her true identity. Her mind raced, quickly calculating new possibilities, evaluating threats, considering countermeasures. Keeping her voice steady despite the growing panic, she replied, "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Sullivan. My name is Amanda Hayes." "Please, let's save time and games, Miss Winters," Sullivan retorted with a slight laugh. "I have in my hands your original school records, adoption records after your father's tragic death, even an old photograph of you that I matched with facial recognition technology. Quite fascinating how you transformed from little orphan Emily Winters into sophisticated Amanda Reynolds, and finally into Mrs. Hayes. An incredible story of determination. And revenge, I presume. What do you want?" Emily asked directly, abandoning useless denials. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Hayes. I was hired to deliver information to your husband, but they didn't specify exactly when I should do so. I'm thinking perhaps you value this information more than he does, at least temporarily. Let's say $100,000 for my report to reach his hands one day late. Enough time for you to, well, do what you need to do." Emily gripped the phone tightly, her mind working furiously. The investigator was effectively offering to sell his temporary silence, giving her just a window of opportunity to execute her plan before Richard discovered everything. The amount was substantial but not impossible. She had access to funds she had set aside precisely for emergencies like this. More importantly, it meant she could no longer wait. The dinner planned for the following night would have to happen immediately after Richard's return, with no chance for rehearsals or last-minute adjustments. "When did you originally plan to deliver the report?" she asked, trying to determine exactly how much time she would have. "I have a meeting scheduled with Mr. Hayes tomorrow at 8 in the evening. Curiously, he mentioned something about an anniversary dinner you would be preparing. It seems he already suspected something and wanted to confirm before confronting you. A cautious man. Your husband." The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow. Richard had suspected her for long enough to hire an investigator. The meeting, strategically planned for before dinner, meant he intended to confront her with the information during the meal she herself would prepare. The irony was almost unbearable. Both were planning to use the same dinner for lethal purposes, each in their own way. "Tomorrow morning, National Bank cash account," Emily finally responded, her decision made. 100,000. No electronic transfers, no checks. "A pleasure doing business with you, Miss Winters. I'll be waiting at the bank at 10, and don't worry. I'm a man of my word. One day is exactly what I promised. No more, no less." When Emily hung up the phone, her mind was clear. All thoughts focused on a single reality. She could no longer delay. The moment she had planned for so many years had finally arrived, forced by circumstances she could no longer control. She picked up the phone again and dialed Martha's room number. "We need to move everything forward," she said as soon as the housekeeper answered, not wasting time with preliminary explanations. "Richard returns tomorrow morning. The dinner happens tomorrow night. It's our only chance before he discovers everything." "I'll be ready," Martha replied, the loyalty evident in her voice. "What do we need to do?" Emily looked at the small dark vial hidden in her drawer, then at the photograph of her father that she kept secretly between the pages of a book. 10 years of planning, of patient waiting, of enduring abuse and humiliation, all culminating in the next 24 hours. Her heart beat with renewed determination, her mind already visualizing every detail of what needed to be done. "Prepare the dinner as we planned," she finally instructed. "Tomorrow night, Richard Hayes will finally pay for what he did to my father." The Hayes mansion gleamed under the golden late afternoon light, the setting sun casting elongated shadows across the meticulously maintained gardens. In the main kitchen, Emily worked with surgical precision, supervising every detail of the special dinner she was preparing for Richard's anniversary. Martha had dismissed the rest of the domestic staff for the night, ensuring that only she and Emily remained in the mansion. The two women moved in perfect synchrony, like dancers performing a choreography rehearsed for years, which in a certain sense was exactly the case. Emily adjusted the oven temperature while finalizing the sauce that would accompany the beef Wellington, Richard's favorite dish. The aroma of thyme, rosemary, and seared meat permeated the environment, creating an atmosphere of indulgent anticipation. Her face remained serene, almost disconnected, as she added the last ingredient to the pan, a few drops of the yellowish liquid from the small vial she had kept so carefully. She stirred with a wooden spoon, observing how the poison dissolved completely, becoming indistinguishable in the rich, dark sauce. "The dish is perfect," Martha commented, observing the process with attentive eyes. "Not even with years of experience could I detect anything different in it. Culinary perfection was one of the many talents I acquired over the years, precisely for this moment," Emily replied, tasting the sauce from a separate part of the pan, not contaminated by the poison. "The taste has to be exceptional, so that he eats every last piece." Richard returned from his business trip shortly after 7 in the evening, his mood visibly better than in previous days. Emily greeted him at the main entrance, wearing an elegant emerald green dress he had bought for her, with a carefully rehearsed smile and a glass of champagne. Her eyes observed every movement Richard made as he handed his coat to Martha, noticing the renewed confidence in his posture, the smug gleam in his gaze. He was in a good mood because he believed he had resolved the crisis with the creditors, and because, as Emily now knew, he planned to confront her after receiving the investigator's report. The irony was delicious. He believed he had control of the situation, completely unaware that the table had been turned long before he even considered his suspicions. "Happy birthday, dear," said Emily, handing him the glass and accepting the mechanical kiss he deposited on her cheek. "I prepared a special dinner to celebrate your date and the success in resolving the financial crisis." "You always know exactly what to do, don't you, Amanda?" Richard replied, his eyes observing her with a different intensity, almost as if trying to see through her facade. "Always so. Foreseeing. It's one of your most admirable qualities." The dining room was impeccably decorated for the occasion. A single table for two, positioned near the large stone fireplace, covered with the finest linen tablecloth and illuminated by silver candelabras. A bottle of rare vintage red wine, taken from Richard's personal cellar and one of his greatest prides, was open to breathe. Fresh flowers in elegant arrangements complemented the decoration, while classical music played softly in the background. Emily had created the perfect setting for the moment she had imagined for a decade. Intimate, elegant, and completely controlled. Richard seemed genuinely impressed upon entering the environment, momentarily forgetting his suspicions in the face of the apparent effort to please him. "You've outdone yourself this time, my dear," he commented, pulling out the chair to sit down. "Almost makes me forget how distant you've been these past few months." "I thought we deserved a special moment, just the two of us," Emily replied, sitting gracefully in the opposite chair. "No staff, no interruptions, just husband and wife celebrating together." Martha served the appetizer, a wild mushroom soup, and then discreetly withdrew, as previously arranged. Emily watched Richard taste the soup, apparently satisfied with the flavor. They talked about trivial matters while eating, a social dance that both executed perfectly after months of practice. Beneath the polite words, however, ran an undercurrent of tension. Emily noticed how Richard's eyes occasionally examined her face, as if looking for clues, signs of nervousness or guilt. He found none. Years of preparation had made Emily practically unreadable when she wished to be. "You seem different tonight," Richard observed after finishing the soup. "There's something almost triumphant about you. Have you achieved some business victory you haven't told me about yet?" "Perhaps I have in a way," Emily replied with an enigmatic smile. "But the evening is about you, Richard. Your achievements, your birthday, your legacy." The main course was served with calculated ceremony. Martha entered carrying a silver tray with the perfectly golden beef Wellington, skillfully cutting it and serving a generous portion on Richard's plate, accompanied by seasonal vegetables and, crucially, an abundant amount of the special sauce. For Emily, she brought a visually identical version, but prepared separately, without the fatal ingredient. Richard inspected the plate with evident appreciation, the rich aroma stimulating his appetite. He raised his wineglass in a toast, his gaze fixed on Emily. "To my wife, always full of surprises," he toasted, a double meaning evident in his words. "May we continue to discover new secrets about each other." "To revealed secrets," Emily responded, touching her glass to his, maintaining eye contact without hesitation, "and to the consequences they bring." While Richard savored each forkful of the carefully prepared dish, Emily observed with clinical attention. He praised the texture of the meat, the perfectly balanced flavor of the sauce, completely unaware that each bite brought him closer to his fate. Between bites, however, his controlling and abusive nature began to emerge, as Emily knew it would. It was almost as if he couldn't help it. Even on an occasion planned to celebrate him, he needed to diminish her, reaffirm his dominance. "The sauce is a bit too salty," he commented after several enthusiastic bites, contradicting his evident pleasure. "And the meat could have stayed in the oven for another minute." "It's always been your problem, Amanda. Almost perfect, but never completely. Always some little detail that ruins the whole thing." "I apologize if it doesn't meet your expectations," Emily responded with false contrition. "How you know I always strive to please you, even if I frequently fall short of the perfection you deserve. That's why I need to be hard on you sometimes," Richard continued, drizzling more poisoned sauce over a piece of meat. "To push you to be better. Many husbands wouldn't even bother." The humiliation continued throughout the meal, as Emily knew it would. Richard criticized everything from the too obvious music to the way she had arranged her hair, inappropriate for the occasion. Each venomous comment was received with the same mask of resigned acceptance that she had perfected throughout their marriage. Underneath, however, Emily mentally counted each insult, each diminishment, adding them to the extensive catalogue of abuses that justified what she was about to do. As Richard spoke, she subtly observed the clock. The investigator would have met Richard at 8, delivering his report. The fact that Richard mentioned nothing about his discoveries meant he was planning a dramatic moment for the confrontation, probably after dinner, when he could fully savor his triumph over her. "I'm considering expanding westward again," Richard announced as he finished his plate. "There's a particularly promising property available. The owner is stubborn, as your father was, but everyone has their price, or their weak point." "Certainly everyone has a vulnerability that can be exploited," Emily agreed, watching him serve himself more wine. "It's just a matter of identifying it and waiting for the right moment to strike." Richard finished eating to the last trace of the sauce, exactly as Emily had planned. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh, swirling the wine in his glass while observing Emily with that calculating look she knew so well. It was the look of a predator, savoring the moment before the attack, believing his prey was completely unaware of the imminent danger. Emily recognized the signs. He was preparing to confront her, to reveal that he knew about her past, to turn the tables in a dramatic gesture that would feed his ego. Before he could begin, however, she took the initiative, rising gracefully to fetch something from a side table. "Before dessert, I have some documents for us to discuss," said Emily, returning with an elegant leather folder and the will that had been registered days earlier. "Things I believe you'll find enlightening." "Documents? In the middle of an anniversary dinner?" questioned Richard, his confused expression momentarily replacing the planned arrogance. What could be so urgent? Emily carefully placed the papers on the table next to Richard's empty plate. The will on top, the folder containing evidence of his criminal activities just below. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. When she sat back down, her face had subtly changed. The mask of submission and devotion she had worn for so long began to dissipate, revealing something cold and relentless underneath, her true self finally emerging after years of concealment. "You know, Richard, I've always wondered what this moment would be like," Emily began, her voice transformed, lower, firmer, without the conciliatory tone he was accustomed to. "For years I've imagined the expression on your face when you finally understood the truth, and I must say, reality is exceeding my expectations." "What game is this, Amanda?" asked Richard, a note of nervousness infiltrating his arrogant voice. "If this is some kind of birthday surprise, it's far from funny." "Oh, it's a surprise, no doubt, but not the kind you expected," replied Emily, opening the will and sliding it closer to him. "This is the document you so carelessly signed a few days ago. It transfers all control of your assets to me in case of your incapacitation, which, by coincidence, is about to happen very soon." Richard picked up the document, his eyes quickly scanning the pages, stopping at the crucial clauses he had previously ignored. His face began to pale, not just from the document's revelation, but because the first symptoms of the poison were beginning to manifest: a slight dizziness, a sudden difficulty in focusing on the words on the page. He looked at Emily with a mixture of anger and growing confusion. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice rising as he tried to stand up, only to feel his legs slightly unstable. "What the hell did you put in the food?" "In a few minutes you'll be dead," confessed Emily with frightening tranquility, sliding the will closer to the husband who had humiliated and mistreated her for years. "Well, perhaps not literally dead, but the person you are, powerful, controlling, abusive, will be effectively ended." Richard looked at the empty plate in front of him, the horrible understanding finally hitting him with full force. He visibly paled, his hands beginning to tremble as he tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Emily observed the transformation with clinical fascination, fear replacing arrogance, vulnerability emerging where before there was only domination. It was exactly as she had imagined for so many years, a moment of perfect reversal. Richard was finally experiencing the powerlessness and terror he had inflicted on so many others. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice betrayed doubt. "This is just a trick to scare me. You wouldn't dare." "I wouldn't dare," repeated Emily, now opening the second folder, revealing photographs, documents, detailed records of his criminal activities spanning decades. "I dared to marry my father's killer. I dared to endure your abuse and humiliations for 2 years. I dared to meticulously plan every detail of this night for an entire decade. What exactly would I lack the courage to do?" The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he tried to process the revelation. His traitorous body continued to succumb to the poison's effects, vision beginning to blur at the edges, tongue feeling strangely heavy in his mouth, extremities tingling with an alarming numbness. With visible effort, he tried to stand again, knocking the chair backward as he leaned on the table to maintain balance. Who are you, really?" he asked, his voice slurring, the control of his facial muscles visibly diminishing. "Look at me, Richard. Look carefully," commanded Emily, calmly rising and removing the blue contact lenses she wore, revealing her natural brown eyes. "Don't you recognize me? Thomas Winter's daughter. The girl who watched hidden while you murdered her father to steal our lands. The child who promised vengeance over his body on that stormy night." Richard staggered backward as recognition finally hit him like a physical wave. His knees gave way and he fell heavily to the floor, his coordination rapidly deteriorating. With desperate effort, he crawled toward the door, determined to seek help. Emily observed his pathetic struggle with the same distant calm she had maintained throughout the evening. Each stumbling movement of Richard, each desperate attempt to escape, was part of the justice she had waited for so long. "It's useless, Richard," she said, slowly circling the table to accompany his pitiful progress. "The poison is already coursing through your system. In a few minutes, you won't be able to move at all. Your mind will remain perfectly clear. I want you to understand exactly what is happening to you, but your body will become a prison. Just as you imprisoned me, just as you imprisoned Martha, just as you imprisoned everyone who dared stand in your way." "Please," begged Richard, his voice almost unrecognizable now, his body contorting in involuntary spasms as he fought against the relentless poison. "Hospital. Need. Help." Emily knelt beside him, her eyes meeting his with hypnotic intensity. All the hatred, all the pain, all the determination that she had accumulated over a decade were visible now, without disguises or masks. For years she had dreamed of this moment of revelation, when she could finally show Richard exactly who she was and what he had created on that rainy night so many years ago. "Do you remember the last thing my father said before you killed him? She will make you pay for this." You looked around, confused, not understanding who he was referring to. You didn't even know I was there, watching everything. That was your greatest flaw, Richard. Your arrogance. Your absolute certainty that you were always in control, that no one would ever dare challenge you. You created your own destruction when you decided you could simply take what you wanted without consequences. As Emily spoke, the effects of the poison intensified dramatically. Richard's body was convulsing now, his muscles contracting involuntarily as his airways began to compromise. His eyes, however, remained terribly alert, reflecting the panic and horror of his situation. Amid the physical collapse, he desperately tried to form words, perhaps a final plea, perhaps a late confession, but his lips merely trembled without producing coherent sounds. "Did you know the poison acts faster when the victim becomes agitated?" Emily commented, observing him clinically. The more you struggle, the faster it spreads through your system. Ironic, isn't it? Your own resistance accelerating your downfall. For a terrible moment, Emily simply watched Richard writhing on the floor, his breathing becoming increasingly difficult, his body gradually losing all voluntary functions. There was a dark satisfaction in witnessing his helplessness, in seeing the man who had caused so much suffering finally experiencing absolute despair. It was the climax of a decade of planning, the reckoning that had sustained her determination through every humiliation and abuse. However, something unexpected began to happen within her as she watched Richard struggling for air. Not compassion, certainly, but a strange clarity about what she really wanted from this revenge. "Martha," Emily finally called, her firm voice cutting through the silence punctuated only by Richard's struggling sounds. "It's time." The housekeeper entered immediately, as if she had been waiting just outside the door. Her gaze lingered momentarily on Richard's contorted body on the floor, a complex expression crossing her face, satisfaction, vengeance, but also a touch of pity for the pathetic creature she had once feared so much. Without needing additional instructions, Martha picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number. Emily knelt again beside Richard, whose wide eyes reflected incomprehension at this new turn of events. "Did you think I would let you die so easily?" she asked, holding his face to force him to look directly at her. "Death would be merciful, Richard, and you don't deserve mercy. No, you will live. You will live in a paralyzed body, completely dependent on the care of others, unable to speak, move, or control any aspect of your existence. You will live to witness as I systematically dismantle everything you built. You will live to see your properties returning to the families you destroyed. You will live to see your name tarnished, your reputation ruined, your legacy transformed into a warning about the dangers of greed and cruelty." Martha returned to inform that the ambulance was on its way. Emily nodded, still maintaining eye contact with Richard, whose eyes now reflected not just fear, but also the horrible recognition of the true nature of his punishment. Death would have been the end, an escape. The life Emily planned for him would be a much more refined and lasting punishment. "Do you know what's most poetic about all this?" Emily continued, her voice almost soft now, as if sharing an intimate secret. "Thanks to the will you so carelessly signed, I will have complete legal control over you and your assets. I will be your legal guardian, responsible for all decisions about your medical care, your finances, every aspect of your existence. You will be completely at my mercy, just as so many were at yours." The distant sounds of sirens began to be audible, rapidly approaching the mansion. Martha moved efficiently to open the gates and guide the paramedics to the dining room. Emily adjusted her expression, preparing to play the role of the desperate wife before the authorities who would soon arrive. While doing this, she leaned in one last time to whisper in Richard's ear, whose body had stopped convulsing and now lay almost completely motionless, only his eyes still moving frantically. "Death would be too easy for you. I want you to live to see everything you built in the hands of the daughter of the man you killed." The paramedics stormed into the dining room moments later, finding a scene of apparent domestic tragedy. A man suffering what seemed to be a severe attack during his birthday dinner, his dedicated wife panicking by his side. Emily played her role perfectly, providing information about non-existent allergies, fabricated previous medical conditions, details that would direct doctors away from the true cause of Richard's condition. Martha confirmed each lie with solemn nods, the pair working in harmony to complete the final act of their elaborate performance. "Please save my husband," Emily implored, convincing tears glistening in her eyes as the paramedics struggled to stabilize Richard. "He is everything to me." The professionals worked frantically, inserting tubes, checking vital signs, applying emergency procedures to keep Richard breathing. Each intervention was exactly what Emily had anticipated. They were, unknowingly, ensuring that her victim would survive to face the much worse fate she had planned. As she watched the paramedics carrying Richard to the ambulance, a perfectly simulated expression of concern on her face, Emily felt a strange sense of completion. 10 years of her life dedicated to this moment. 10 years of preparation, sacrifice, and infinite patience, culminating not in a vengeful murder, but in something much more sophisticated, a poetic justice that would force Richard to experience the powerlessness and dependence he had inflicted on so many others. "I'll accompany him to the hospital," Emily announced to Martha as she followed the paramedics outside. "Take care of everything here, as we arranged." "Yes, ma'am," Martha replied with a slight nod, perfectly understanding the implicit instructions. Ensure that no evidence of the poison remained, that everything was impeccable for any subsequent investigation. As the ambulance departed swiftly, sirens howling into the night, Emily sat beside the stretcher where Richard was immobilized. His vital systems were stabilizing under intensive medical care, ensuring he would survive to face the fate she had so meticulously planned. Leaning forward, out of earshot of the paramedics busy with equipment and monitors, Emily allowed herself one last moment of honest communication with the man who had destroyed her childhood. "This is not the end, Richard," she whispered, her tone mixing satisfaction and promise. "It's just the beginning of your true punishment." Richard's eyes, the only parts of his body still capable of movement, fixed on her with a lucid terror that confirmed he fully understood. Emily leaned back, an appropriate expression of concern returning to her face as the ambulance sped through the night, carrying them both to the next chapter of their shared history, a chapter where, finally, she would control every page. The antiseptic corridors of the hospital pulsed with constant activity, doctors and nurses moving with clinical efficiency between rooms. In the intensive care unit, a team of specialists gathered around the bed where Richard Hayes remained motionless, connected to an impressive array of monitoring equipment. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the dinner. 2 weeks of incessant tests, specialized consultations, and conflicting diagnoses. Emily remained constantly at his bedside, perfectly playing the role of devoted and anguished wife. No one questioned her presence in medical discussions, her insistence on understanding every detail of the treatment, her right to make decisions on behalf of her incapacitated husband. Behind the mask of concern, Emily observed with clinical satisfaction how the doctors struggled to determine the exact cause of Richard's condition. Standard toxicology tests had detected only insignificant traces of the plant used, insufficient for a conclusive diagnosis. Medical theories ranged from complex stroke to a rare neurodegenerative condition, but none fully explained the specific pattern of neurological damage. "Mrs. Hayes, we need to discuss long-term expectations," said the chief neurologist, Dr. Bennett, leading Emily to a private conference room after the latest round of tests. "The damage to your husband's central nervous system is extensive and, unfortunately, appears to be permanent." "Be direct, doctor," Emily replied, her voice carefully modulated to express controlled emotional strength. "I need to know exactly what to expect, so I can plan his care appropriately." The final medical assessment was precisely what Emily had planned. Richard had suffered severe and irreversible neurological damage. He would remain partially paralyzed, with extremely limited mobility on the right side of his body. His speech was compromised. He might eventually recover some basic words, but would never return to normal communication. Fine motor control in both hands was permanently impaired. Most importantly, his cognitive function remained intact. Richard was fully conscious, able to understand everything around him, to feel emotions, to suffer with his new reality. Emily listened to the prognosis with a grave expression, but her heart sang in triumph. It was exactly the fate she had planned for him, a physical prison from which he could never escape, with full awareness of his condition. "What are our long-term treatment options?" she asked, already knowing the answer but maintaining the facade of a concerned wife. "Are there specialized facilities that you recommend, doctor?" "There certainly are excellent rehabilitation and long-term care centers," confirmed the physician, flipping through a folder of information. "I can provide a list of the best institutions in the region. Mr. Hayes's insurance should cover a large part of the costs." Emily's decision, announced the following day, surprised the medical team and quickly spread through the local community as a notable example of marital devotion. In a formal meeting with the doctors, nurses, and social workers responsible for the case, Emily declared her intention to personally care for Richard at the mansion, transforming an entire wing into a private rehabilitation center, hiring only a small team of nurses for specific assistance. Her presentation was impeccable. She had extensively studied care for patients with neurological damage, consulted specialists about necessary equipment, planned structural modifications to the mansion to accommodate a wheelchair. No one questioned her motivations. On the contrary, she was widely praised for her extraordinary dedication. "I understand this decision may seem unusual," Emily said during the meeting, her voice laden with false emotion. "But I know my husband. I know he will recover better in his own home, surrounded by familiar things, cared for by someone who loves him." "It's an immense responsibility, Mrs. Hayes," warned the social worker, clearly impressed but concerned. "The daily care will be extremely demanding, both physically and emotionally." "Richard took care of me all these years," Emily replied with a gentle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now it's my turn to reciprocate. Till death do us part. Wasn't that what I promised?" In the weeks that followed, while overseeing modifications to the mansion to receive Richard, Emily began implementing the next phase of her plan. With the will already formalized and her status as legal guardian confirmed, she took complete control of Hayes's businesses and properties. The local community interpreted her decisive actions as evidence of a strong wife, taking on responsibilities to maintain her husband's legacy during his recovery. Few noticed that each business decision, each new policy implemented, each administrative change was meticulously calculated to dismantle the empire Richard had built. In meetings with managers, lawyers, and business associates, Emily presented her radical proposals with such persuasive skill that even the most skeptical ended up agreeing with her vision. "Times have changed, and we must change with them," she declared in a crucial meeting with the main executives of Hayes companies. "Richard always believed in adaptation and innovation. He trusted me to make these decisions, and I will honor his trust by transforming his businesses to face the challenges of the future. With all due respect, Mrs. Hayes, some of these changes directly contradict policies that your husband defended for decades," argued one of the oldest executives, visibly uncomfortable. "The return of these specific lands to the original families, for example. My husband and I discussed these issues at length before his accident," Emily replied, her firm voice leaving no room for questioning. Richard recognized that some past acquisitions were problematic. He wishes to correct old mistakes, while he can still leave a positive legacy. "If anyone here doesn't feel comfortable implementing this new vision, feel free to seek opportunities elsewhere." 3 months after the accident, Richard Hayes returned to his property, not as the powerful magnate who had left, but as a mute invalid confined to a high-tech wheelchair that he could not operate independently. Emily organized a discreet reception, allowing selected employees and close associates to briefly see Richard's debilitated state, a strategic move that simultaneously generated sympathy and discouraged any questioning of her authority to manage the business on his behalf. The east wing of the mansion had been completely remodeled to accommodate Richard's medical needs, with rehabilitation equipment, monitoring, and a basic communication system activated by eye movement. Emily hired 2 professional nurses for alternating shifts, carefully selected for their discretion and efficiency, and personally assumed supervision of all aspects of Richard's care. "Welcome to your new world, Richard," said Emily in their first truly private moment since his return, after the nurses and visitors had finally withdrawn. "I'm sure you've noticed some changes during the journey here. This is just the beginning. I'm being extremely generous, you know," she continued, adjusting the wheelchair so Richard could look out the window at the fields beyond the mansion. "I could have left you to rot in some low-quality institution, neglected, forgotten. Instead, you'll have the best medical care, cutting-edge equipment, everything money can buy. After all, I want you to remain fully conscious and healthy for the next many, many years." Richard's eyes, now his only effective form of communication, conveyed an intense and impotent hatred that only fed Emily's satisfaction. In the days that followed, she established a calculated routine. Each morning during the breakfast she personally administered, she would discuss in detail the changes she was implementing in the business, displaying documents and reports that he could see but not touch. In the afternoon, she frequently took Richard on tours around the property, showing him the physical transformations, workers demolishing fences that had unjustly divided acquired properties, new projects being built on previously undeveloped lands, families returning to homes from which they had been evicted. Each tour was narrated with detailed and deliberately provocative descriptions, each reaction of frustration in Richard's eyes savored as a small victory. "See that family over there, Richard?" Emily asked during one of these tours, pointing to a group working on a small, newly returned plot of land. "The older man is Charles Whitfield. You drove his family out 15 years ago when they refused to sell. You threatened his children, contaminated their well, remember? Now they're back with legal deed and we're providing financing for them to rebuild. It's just one of dozens of families I'm bringing back." "That's unnecessary cruelty," responded the afternoon nurse, a middle-aged man named David, who inadvertently witnessed the comment as he approached with medication. "Taunting a man unable to respond." "Just ensuring my husband stays connected with the changes in his business," Emily replied smoothly, her tone instantly shifting to that of the attentive wife. "The doctors say mental stimulation and constant updating are crucial for his recovery." "Isn't that right, dear?" Weeks turned into months, and months into a full year. The transformation of the Hayes property and associated businesses progressed at a steady and relentless pace. Emily implemented each change with strategic precision, always ensuring that the most significant actions, particularly those dismantling aspects of the empire Richard most valued, were carried out where he could personally witness them. Martha, officially elevated to the position of property manager, worked in close partnership with Emily, her decades of experience in the mansion proving invaluable. With her help, Emily identified all the loyal employees who had suffered abuse under Richard's command, promoting them to positions of authority while discreetly dismissing those who had been complicit in his cruelest practices. "I never imagined seeing this day," Martha confessed during an afternoon working in the main office, previously Richard's exclusive territory, now completely redesigned to reflect Emily's aesthetic. "For years I dreamed of some form of justice, but nothing so complete." "It's not just revenge, Martha," replied Emily, signing documents that finalized the transfer of a large parcel of land to a cooperative of small farmers. "It's reparation. Every decision I make aims to correct a specific wrong he caused. We are undoing decades of cruelty, act by act." "What about him?" asked Martha, looking through the window to the garden where Richard was positioned in his chair, apparently enjoying the afternoon sun, a nurse discreetly positioned nearby. "It's strange to see him like this, so diminished." "He chose his fate the moment he pulled the trigger against my father," replied Emily, her voice momentarily hardening. "Each day of his current existence is a direct consequence of his own actions. Justice is rarely so poetic." Emily's reputation in the community grew in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Initially seen only as the dedicated wife of a powerful man who suffered a tragedy, she gradually transformed into a respected figure in her own right. The progressive changes she implemented in Hayes Enterprises, better working conditions, fairer wages, environmentally responsible practices, community programs, generated genuine loyalty among employees and neighbors. The return of lands to unjustly dispossessed families was publicly presented as a historical reconciliation initiative supposedly planned by Richard before his incapacitation. The scholarships, free medical clinics and community centers established with Hayes resources transformed the family's perception from feared exploiters to valued benefactors. It was an irony that Emily deeply appreciated, using wealth accumulated through decades of exploitation to dismantle the very system that generated it, all while building an impeccable public reputation. "Mrs. Hayes, the community would like to honor you at this year's Harvest Festival," announced the president of the local Farmers Association during a visit. "Your work has transformed this region in just 18 months. We want to formally recognize your contribution." "I am merely the temporary steward of my husband's legacy," Emily responded with false modesty. "Richard always had vision for this community's potential. I'm merely implementing plans we discussed for years." "Even so, the speed and effectiveness with which you've implemented these changes is remarkable," insisted the man, clearly impressed. "Many of us have observed this property for decades and never imagined seeing it so integrated with the surrounding community." "Circumstances sometimes force us to act more decisively," Emily replied, allowing a calculated smile. "Tragedies can catalyze transformations that would otherwise take generations." On a particularly significant afternoon, 2 years after the accident, Emily implemented the final act of her meticulously planned revenge. In the center of the ranch, visible from almost every angle of the main property, stood a monument that Richard had commissioned years before, a life-sized bronze statue of himself mounted on his favorite horse in a heroic pose, with a plaque detailing his supposed contributions to the region. It was a physical symbol of his excessive ego, a self-proclaimed tribute that Emily had deliberately left intact until that moment. She had scheduled its removal for a specific day, ensuring that Richard was positioned on the main veranda with a clear view of the event. A small crowd of employees and local residents gathered to witness, many secretly relieved to see the symbol of the old order finally removed. "Today we mark the end of one era and the beginning of another," Emily announced to those present, her clear voice carrying easily across the open space. "This monument represents values of the past, individualism without consideration for others, success measured only by personal acquisitions. In its place, we will build a memorial that honors all the families who worked this land, that recognizes collective contributions instead of glorifying a single man. My husband agreed to this change before his accident," she continued, gesturing toward Richard on the veranda, who watched with eyes burning with impotent fury. He recognized that his true legacy isn't in bronze or plaques, but in the improved lives of those around him. At Emily's signal, the workers activated the equipment, and slowly with a metallic creak the statue was pulled from its pedestal, descending to the ground with a dull impact that symbolically reverberated throughout the property. The crowd spontaneously applauded, many with expressions of barely disguised relief. Emily observed the moment with deep satisfaction, decades of planning culminating in this final act of dismantling. After the applause diminished and the crowd began to disperse, Emily gestured to Martha. "I'm going to have a private moment with Richard," she said softly. "Please make sure we're not interrupted." Climbing the porch steps where Richard's wheelchair was positioned, Emily dismissed the nurse with a gentle gesture. For the first time in many days, they were truly alone. She pulled a chair to sit directly in front of him, their eyes at the same level. Richard's face had changed significantly in the 2 years since the poisoning, thinner, with deeper lines of constant frustration, eyes that had lost their previous arrogance but maintained a flame of contained hatred. He could slightly move his left hand now, press a button connected to a voice synthesizer with pre-programmed phrases, but these were limited to basic needs and simple responses. Emily observed him for a long moment, absorbing the completeness of her victory. "It's finished, Richard," she finally said, her voice low but clear, without pretension or disguise for the first time in years. "It took longer than originally planned, but I wanted to ensure that every aspect of your empire was methodically deconstructed, every pillar of your legacy reframed, every piece of stolen land returned. It took 2 full years, but I've finally finished." Richard's eyes fixed on hers, decades of fury and frustration evident in his penetrating gaze. With visible effort, he pressed the button on the chair, activating one of the pre-programmed phrases. "I need something." The robotic, dispassionate voice was a surreal contrast to the emotion in his eyes. "What you need is to fully understand what happened," Emily continued, ignoring the request. "Everything you built, every piece of land you stole, every family you destroyed, every business you ruined, all has been undone. Your former associates now answer to me. Those families you drove out are thriving again on their ancestral lands. The people you abused and intimidated for decades now hold positions of respect in the community." Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone, her eyes never leaving his. "And most delicious of all, the community adores me for it. They believe I'm implementing your vision, that these changes were part of some redemption plan you conceived before the accident. Your name won't be remembered with fear and hatred as it deserved, but as part of a narrative of transformation and reparation. Even in this, I've denied you your true identity." As she spoke, a subtle transformation occurred on Richard's face. The constant fury in his eyes gradually gave way to something more complex, not acceptance or peace, but a reluctant recognition of the completeness of his defeat. A single tear ran down his wrinkled face, a sign of surrender more powerful than any verbal confession could have been. Emily observed the tear with clinical fascination, that small drop of water representing the culmination of her meticulously executed revenge. "My father wanted only a dignified life, and you took that from him," said Emily, finally rising and adjusting the shawl on her shoulders. "Now you'll have a long life, Richard, to contemplate everything you've lost." He pressed another button, producing a different phrase. "I'm sorry." The synthetic voice, flat and emotionless, stripped of any nuance or sincerity that might have existed in the intention behind it, hovered briefly in the air between them. "Your regret arrives 2 years and a decade too late," Emily responded, her voice neither harsh nor compassionate, simply factual. "I have no interest in it, just as I have no more interest in you. My revenge is complete. Now I will live my own life." Turning, Emily walked to the porch railing, contemplating the property that stretched before her, now truly hers in every sense. The lands that had once belonged to her family were again part of a greater whole, not as stolen property, but as part of an interconnected community. The mansion, once a monument to one man's greed and selfishness, now partially served as a community center and educational facility. Her father's legacy, a man who valued justice and dignity above material wealth, had been honored not through monuments, but through the transformed lives of all those Richard had harmed. "Martha is coming to take you inside," said Emily without turning. "Your afternoon medications are late." When Martha appeared moments later, Emily passed by her with just a brief nod, descending the porch steps to the gardens below. She felt a strange lightness, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For 10 years she had lived only for her revenge, dedicating every thought, every action, every moment to the methodical destruction of the man who had murdered her father. Now, with that revenge finally consummated, she faced an entirely new question. Who was Emily Winters when not defined by hatred and desire for retribution? It was a question that, for the first time, she felt free to explore. "Is everything all right?" asked Martha, catching up to her in the garden after arranging for Richard's care. "You look different." "I'm free," Emily replied simply, feeling the afternoon sun on her face. "Free from him, free from the past, free from the person I needed to become to achieve justice." "And what will you do now?" asked Martha, studying her with keen eyes that had witnessed the entire saga unfold. "Your entire plan is completed. Your whole purpose for so many years." Emily contemplated the question for a moment, looking out at the fields beyond the garden, the people working in harmony where once there had been only exploitation and fear. She hadn't planned beyond this point, never really believing she would reach a moment when her revenge would be truly complete. Now, faced with this reality, she found unexpected possibilities blossoming in her mind. "I think I'm going to live, Martha," she finally answered, a genuine smile emerging on her face for the first time in longer than she could remember. Just live. Did you enjoy the story of Martha and Emily? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you right here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.